had. And I'll then tell you another little story about that relates to an old short story by Raymond Carver. And then I'll kind of try to figure out what this all means, at least to me. And I'm so glad that you're here to kind of see it as well as I figure this out. So with that, let's kind of dive in and give you just this, for those of you who don't know, which I would say would be the majority of the public, what sabbatical is. I'll give you a quick historical overview. So you just go to Google things and ask the Google questions, or go to Wikipedia for all authoritative answers. And of course, it could never possibly be wrong. And in this case, it's pretty set, pretty true. If you go to Wikipedia, it will tell you that the sabbatical is based on biblical practice. It comes out of Genesis, on the seventh day we rest, or in Leviticus, making sure the fields get a chance to recover. So, if there is anything more obscure than the Policies and Procedure Manual of Weber State, I would think it would be the Bible. So we put those two things together and defined what a sabbatical is for here at Weber State. Basically, every 7 terms or every 7 years, you get a chance to apply for a sabbatical. You get the chance to do some kind of research leave or do something that is outside of your normal load. I have this image here of me hiking in, I think, Coyote Gulch, just to kind of give you a sense of how I think about that. I've heard colleagues say, we should call these sabbatical leaves, we should call them research leaves so that the public really understands what they are. And I'll push back on that a little bit, just to say that I think there are many reasons to take a leave, from doing more research to mental health to just getting a fresh new perspective. And I honestly would advocate and wish that more professions outside of academia had sabbatical leaves, because they're really, really valuable to get this chance to switch up and just see your profession in a new way. It should be maybe more obvious that to have a sabbatical in the spring term of 2020 was particularly advantageous. Like, if ever you were going to have a sabbatical, that would probably be the time to do it. And I thought at the time, for those of you who are kind of paying attention to how things were operating in College of Science in January, I thought, you know what, this is super lucky. I don't have to deal with the renovation of Lynn Lecture Hall. You suckers, you're going to have to deal with it. And I took off, and then, well, this other thing happened called pandemic. And this Scrabble draw that I had, this was an actual draw, kind of summarized what that means for sabbatical as well as for just the time that we live in. It's just a bunch of vowels that don't spell really anything except for the chorus to Old MacDonald's Farm. And I should say that I'm so grateful to my colleagues who did not make me feel guilty for being away when this disaster of a semester was kind of falling out from underneath us. And I could not have timed it any better. But at the same time, it made sabbatical different than what I expected. I'll kind of show you some twists and turns that took. But to give you kind of an idea of what you would do on a sabbatical, most of this stuff is not what I had planned. There's some things that you should do, like I'm going to sit down and read more books, because that is such a great privileged thing to be able to do, to schedule that into your day. So I read some pretty good books, and you'll see there's some stuff that I've slurped out of these books and put into my practice, as well as into some of the work I'm doing. I got to play more piano than I usually do. I got to do more running than I usually do. I got to go to Washington, D.C. in February to be on a National Science Foundation panel. So I got to put on my big boy pants, and I got to wear a badge, and I got to be part of I felt so important to be there. I got to help host a science education conference put on by the Utah Science Teachers Association, thanks to Don Monson, who's here today. I'll give you a few pictures of that. I got to work on an old interview with a former poet laureate that's going to go into an anthology. I got to prepare a keynote that was supposed to be given in December that got canceled. I got to help hire a community engagement coordinator for the College of Science, which I probably shouldn't have done technically, but that is so helpful for me in my future, because Amanda Gentry is going to be running things like Science in the Parks. That kind of frees up this expands the potential for things that we get to do for community engagement on behalf of the college. I got to help with an NSF grant with Rachel Bachman, which if you're ever going to write an NSF grant, write it with Rachel Bachman, except that I want to write all my grants with Rachel Bachman. She's such an outstanding colleague in math education. And then there was this thing called the pandemic, and that we kind of pivoted for that. I'll get to that in a second. But just to give you some, this was just such an exciting thing for me to be able to do, to go to the National Science Foundation and go to the big doors and in the big brick building and get your bag scanned and your ID checked and your everything verified. And it says right here, NSF, like, you might not appreciate what a big deal this felt like for me, but it's just like thrilling. And then you just all you had to do was work for 14 hours a day for 3 days straight. And then you could go outside. And so I did that. I also, this is some images right here in Tracy Hall, which I kind of like seeing just because it looks suddenly so foreign to us. This was 485 teachers here on this campus on the Saturday, February 29th. And this was a magical, magical thing. I thought we would have 100 people, but they kept signing up for this conference that we'd set up. They filled just every space that we had. Thank goodness the dean's office let me do this, and the department chairs let me do this and use so many different spaces. And the other thing I should say, if you're ever going to plan a conference, plan it on Leap Day, February 29th, the Saturday before spring break at Weber State, and also squeak it in right before pandemic hits. That's the way to do it. And it worked out pretty well. Little did we know what was about to happen. But I'm so grateful that that got to happen. And another thing, this is just, one of those shameless plugs. I'm in a band and I play piano. And on March 11th, we got to do jazz at the station with, our Ian and Karen and this chemist. Chemists are useful. He plays bass. And I got to play piano. But what's significant to me about this particular image is I probably right as this note is being hit, there are reports of Utah Jazz players, the basketball team, coming down with coronavirus. And it was like in the next couple of days that everything just went to pieces. This was the last public event that I know of that happened as we entered the pandemic. And then I entered a whole new state of existence, which was going to rescue one kid who was stranded in Washington in a dorm room. So I went and picked her up, brought her home, and another kid working on graduating from high school. So, and we got a puppy. We had kind of a hard year. So the puppy made things much better and is adorable. And she's doing quite well and only jumps up to chase the cat on the couch occasionally now instead of all the time. But then life looked more or less like this, which I presume that it looked like this for many of us, where we're doing online kinds of classes. So in the context of me, I thought I had the house to myself to do all my writing projects. And then I had the house to myself along with everyone else on their computers, learning remotely here, doing their high school graduation work with the help of the cat, teaching knitting classes and videoing knitting tutorials, talking to family thousands of miles away. Over here, this is how you take dance class online remotely. I'm sure Anna's thrilled that I got that captured. But this all kind of brought to me the idea of what does it mean to be doing school in the first place? So I started revamping my writing and seeing what I could do to help people like think about their classrooms. And one of the things I started doing was looking at resources I could provide that said, you know what, you're trying to do science for science education's sake. Let's not try to take school science and put it at home. Let's try to take authentic science and just reimagine what science education could look like. So I started doing things like taking pictures of water droplets on plants and looking at how things drop and looking at what kinds of things can you do at home to learn science that can be a new scenario, a new paradigm for science learning. And that all relates to kind of what I was looking for in the first place, which was like, what do we mean by learning? What do we want out of schools? And we apparently really, really value schools. I mean, here you all are. You came to school in this strange pandemic kind of setting. We've had public school in the United States before there was United States. This little plaque here is embedded in the sidewalk in Boston to say, here's the Latin school. That was the first public school established in 1630 or something like that. Ben Franklin went here, Sam Adams went here. John Hancock learned how to write that giant signature here in this school that was based on a dead language of all things. But we thought this is so important. We should actually provide a monument for this. And this is what kind of leads me to my query for my whole sabbatical and perhaps the rest of my professional life. And that is, why do we need school in the first place? So let me describe for you my experience with school. This is, in case you couldn't tell, this is me. I should point out, my haircut now, which I did myself, is better than the haircut that someone gave to me when I was in first grade. I didn't notice this until it was so much bigger. And apparently my parents couldn't keep track of the three of their children. So they labeled us Adam, Jennifer, and Mark. But so anyway, here's basically the context of me in some of my first most important learning in first grade. Here's the place where that important learning actually happened. This is Oakdale Heights Elementary School in the town in which I grew up. Rainbows apparently just come out of the building all the time, and it's always blue skies there in Western Oregon. Not really. And my classroom is right there. You're literally looking at my classroom where I would be in the first grade. This is such an important place to me that I still remember the school song. Oakdale School, you're a part of me, always will be for eternity. Memories we all hold dear. And that's about a third of it. And it's just like this is just this experience has seeped into me in really deep, meaningful ways. So everything that I'm about to say about my education at Oakdale Heights Elementary School, taken to that context, this is important to me. But so was the morning of the 26th of February, 1979, the latter part of my first grade. And if you go again to the authoritative source, to Wikipedia, to see what happened on the 26th of February of 1979, the last century, it will say that we were about to have a solar eclipse. The first once in a lifetime event of my short life would be happening. And we changed the schedule for school. We changed the buses so that we would get to school early so that we wouldn't be on the bus or waiting for the bus or at home. We would all be at school to experience this monumental, life-changing kind of event from that classroom. That we knew the sky was going to go dark. We knew about how the sun was going to change. We knew, I didn't really understand it, but there's some kind of geometry going on, and we were going to be there to take that in as part of our educational experience. The next opportunity, it says here on the wiki, would be 38 years later on August 21st, 2017, which would be a long time away. I don't know why it says here also a Monday. Like, it was on a Monday, but the next one's going to be on a Monday too. So just suck it up, everyone. That's just how Mondays are. This guy goes dark. Anyway, There's lots written about this particular eclipse, like all eclipses. If you've experienced one, you can kind of get a sense for this. One of my favorite authors, Annie Dillard, wrote about seeing this from, I think she was in the vicinity of Mount Adams, just on the other side of the border, on the Washington side of the border, close to where I lived. She says, the alpenglow is that red light of sunset which holds out on snowy mountaintops long after the valleys and tablelands are dimmed. Look at Mount Adams, I said. And that was the last sane moment I remember. If you know what a solar eclipse is like, it's that loss of sanity, I think, has a real resonance. That, and she goes on to say, the sun was going and the world was wrong. Like something fundamentally alters not just the physical landscape, but the emotional landscape, the feel of that space. And I was about to get to experience this as a first grader. It went like this. I'll show you. Here's my classroom. I got this out of a educational or teaching methods textbook about how to organize your classroom in 1979. You can see the diverse collection of students here: right-handers, left-handers, short hairs, long hairs. I've never, yeah, you can have long hair and be right or left-handed. You can be short-haired and left or right. For some reason, there's like 50% of these people are left-handed. It's an extraordinary place. There's a projector that pitches off into the corner, like any good classroom should have a projector that pitches to the corner, light switches, the podium. And here's what we did. So the eclipse was happening early in the morning. We were all positioned in our desks, all apparently 35 of us. And as this started to take place, Mrs. L, I will say, went to the windows and she pulled the drapes. And I pause here because I still can't get over this. And she monitored the drapes and we could see kinda that everything outside was going dark and we were told to stay right here. I remember I was about right here. And a few minutes later, I remember Mrs. L went back to she was standing right here, standing guard, and she could kind of tell that it was starting to get light again, and she opened the drapes back up, and we went back to doing our reading homework, or doing our, I don't know, penmanship, or whatever the hell we were doing. This was my first, yes, Dr. Palin, seriously, this was my first experience with science in an authentic, firsthand way, my once-in-a-lifetime event. So I was kind of disappointed. And then with every, yeah, who is Mrs. L? Yeah. I don't know that she was so much different from any other first grade teacher. And I don't know the whole, I mean, I was a first grader. I didn't understand. Mrs. L taught me how to read. That's pretty good, right? But yeah, it's the saddest thing I ever heard too. But I missed out on something. And I've carried that with me for a long time. And I've carried that with me to think about what is it that we do to our students in schools that could be similar. And I'll say, I still turned out okay. By many people say, my mother said I turned out okay. And I've learned a few things since then. And one of those things was I learned something about going outside and learning how to backpack. And I used this picture. This is me right here. Frodo and Samwise are somewhere out in front. I'm just trailing behind them. This is coming over Forster Path in the Sierras. And my Karen, my wife, her Uncle Mark, taught me basically how to backpack. Actually, Karen introduced me to backpacking, and then I've learned a lot about long, extended treks in the backcountry from Uncle Mark, and he took this picture of me. And that was also a life-changing experience that was not taken from me. And I've since been able to show other people about backpacking and take them on trips. This is, oops. Sorry. This is my daughter, Anna, when she's 15 or 16. We're hiking across this is called Death Canyon. And this is Death Canyon Plateau, or Death Canyon Shelf, actually. So charming place in the Tetons, on the Teton Crest Trail. And these kinds of experiences gave me a new opportunity. And that opportunity was in 2017. I actually saw the possibility of backpacking into the Wind Rivers, into the backcountry, and experiencing the solar eclipse there. This is a couple pictures of Karen and Anna, my wife and daughter, on our way in. And this is Grace and Anna, my daughters, on what should have been their first day of their sophomore and senior years of high school. Let me give you some context. Anna didn't care that she was missing her first day of high school of her senior year. Like, she's a senior. Like, really? Why is that important? Grace was mad that she was missing her first day of her sophomore year of high school. And she got it, like, oh, we're all going to do this, and this is going to be fun, and this is going to be a once-in-a-lifetime experience. But she was not at all convinced this was a better idea than going to school. But that same morning, when they should have been in a classroom, you know, just like I was in a classroom for my first solar eclipse, we hiked up to this place, Lester Pass, which is above that snowfield up there in the Wind Rivers. It's at about 11,000 feet. It's about 2 days in. I was going to get as far away from people as possible so no one pulled the drapes on me this time. Damn it. And we trek up through the snowfield, and we get up to this magical, magical place of Lester Pass with the mountains in the background. Those are the small ones in the background. The Continental Divide is in the other direction. And as the eclipse approaches us from the west, you can start maybe to get a sense the sky is doing something funny. And then you get a sense that there is a shadow somewhere else. And then that shadow crosses and envelops you. And then you turn the other way and you get this. If you've been there, you know what this is like. I don't have to say anything. If you weren't there, I don't know what to tell you. Annie Dillard says that everything seemed wrong, but I can say everything seemed right. Everything about that moment was good. And I learned something there. And I'm glad that this was just one of those whimsical ideas. I said, I'll put a camera there mounted on my backpack sitting on the ground, and I'll just let it take in the change of scenery. And so on days, any day, especially during a pandemic, I'm going to scroll through this, turn the sun off, turn it back on, turn it off, turn it on, and go back and forth. And this is exactly why I wanted this, is the ability to do that. But also, you probably won't be able to hear the video all that well, but it's there. If you have headphones on, you might catch some of this. If I set this in motion.
Oh my God.
There's some wind there, but you'll also get some gasps. Oh yeah, some expletives. And just these, you just like absolutely spontaneous, like, oh my dear God, this is something you can't compare to anything else. And I've come back to that over and over again and thought, I wonder if I could get my classes to react this way. Like, can I give them a learning experience where they're like, oh my, probably not, but maybe, or maybe we shouldn't try to like fall short of that. Maybe we shouldn't give up on that. I'm really grateful that I got those sound clips. In particular, it would be hard for you to hear this, but right around 6 minutes after all of this has happened, there's chatter. And right there, I don't think you could hear unless you had headphones on, you had this really turned up. But Grace, the kid who resented us doing this, she said, who needs school? Which just melted my heart. Of course, who needs school? Yes, me, the educator, the one who's an advocate for schools, his daughter's the one who's saying, who needs school? And I totally agreed with her. And this is where I want to take this inquiry is who does need school? Why do we have it in the first place? Should we reconsider it? And especially in the context of how many things we don't get from school. Why is that? And maybe let's reconsider what is it that schools should be providing in the first place. Maybe it can't give us solar eclipses all the time, but maybe there are other alternatives. And certainly we're not the first people to have thought of this. There's this next chapter in the talk, which addresses all the different educational innovations, not all of them. Here's a list of different educational innovations I could imagine. Like we've got different, like quote unquote, delivery modes or different ways to set up classrooms or schools that are called direct instruction or discovery learning or problem-based or competency-based credentialing. That's a new one that's in vogue. And then we have all these different themes, like it's STEM or it's STEAM or it's STREAM or it's about cultural literacy, it's about values education. And then there are all these tools, overhead projectors, one of my favorites, which television is supposed to revolutionize everything. PowerPoint is supposed to revolutionize everything. iPads are supposed to revolutionize everything. And on and on and on. Now we throw Chromebooks at everyone and say, here, it's fixed now. But I wonder. And I wonder in particular because we keep seeing these kinds of innovations. Here's one of the most recent. If you have a social media account, you probably get ads for MasterClass. It says, hey, not doing anything right now? Spend a few $100s and you can get experiences about, firsthand experiences about becoming a professional ballet dancer or a chef or everything, a photographer, a musician, fill in the blank. And the writer who's kind of going through this in a recent article in The Atlantic said, this sounds really, really great until you realize it's like being seated next to the dinner guest of your dreams, the Dalai Lama or Barack Obama, and discovering that they won't stop talking and that the dinner is 12 courses long. And it's maybe not so different from the way we're producing education here at the university, which we should be careful of. We're not the first people to have thought, we're not the first generation to have thought of these kinds of innovations. The poster of my talk had a clip from the Jetsons where they were being taught by a computer robot. This comic from the bottom right from the 1950s has all of these students in front of monitors with someone giving them instruction from a bigger monitor. And they're all looking into the monitors instead of each other. Also, flying cars, damn it. We don't have the flying cars here. We've got everything here except for the flying cars. And then this image from the 1964 World's Fair, which would look very, very familiar as a show of the future. And as Smithsonian is documenting what they're presenting here, it's teachers instructing by video phone, envisioned as the classroom of tomorrow. Each child sits in front of a console which has a screen displaying equations, multiple colored buttons, and what looks like maybe a video camera or microphone mounted on the top center of the desk, which probably sounds pretty familiar. We are the future without the flying cars. But the most just shaking example of this futuristic vision comes from a story written by Isaac Asimov in 1951. It was reprinted many, many times. I remember reading this, I think around 3rd grade, and it stuck with me, kind of like that solar eclipse. This story is called The Fun They Had. You can look this up. It's about 2 kids, Margie and Tommy, and Margie wrote in her diary on May 17th, 2155, that Tommy found a real book printed on real paper, not just one of those screens. And Margie had hoped that he wouldn't know how to that the repairman wouldn't know how to put her mechanical teacher back together again. He'd come to repair the mechanical teacher sitting there in the room in her house with the screen and all the buttons and all the lessons. Centuries ago, Tommy told her, Yeah, those kids had a teacher, but it wasn't a regular teacher. It was a man. How disappointing. And Margie protests, a man can't know as much as a teacher. My mother says a teacher has to be adjusted to fit the mind of each boy and girl it teaches, and that each kid has to be taught differently, which, yeah, maybe. But how can we possibly compare with the robots? And then the story of the future vision of, by the way, this is a future of 2155, but I'm sure it feels familiar now. The last bit of this story is Margie went into the schoolroom. It was right next to her bedroom, and the mechanical teacher was on and waiting for her. It was always on at the same time every day except Saturday and Sunday because little girls learned better if we had regular hours. The screen lit up. It said, today's arithmetic lesson is on the addition of proper fractions. Please upload your homework and push the submit button on Canvas now. Margie did so with a sigh. She was thinking about the old schools they had when her grandfather's grandfather was a little boy. All the kids from the whole neighborhood came, laughing and shouting in the schoolyard, sitting together in the schoolroom, going home together at the end of the day. They learned the same thing so they could help one another on the homework and talk about it. And the teachers were people. The mechanical teacher was flashing on the screen when we add the fractions 1/2 and 1/4. But Margie was thinking about how the kids must have loved it in the old days. She was thinking about the fun they had. Yes, the before time, Dr. Armstrong. Which makes me think about what was the fun they had or we had? What is it that we think is so important about those particular actual interactions that we can't replace? Even Isaac Asimov can't imagine us replacing with the robots and the screens and the submit buttons on the canvas. And it makes me rethink what do we want out of school in the first place if we think what we could have out of school is some kind of robotic intervention, some kind of computer intervention, some kind of automated intervention. Is there some other deeper purpose that we're missing? And who determines what that is and how we make it happen? And how does this all correlate to what we think of teachers and teaching? Well, I'd like to suggest a few possibilities. What we talk about when we talk about learning, that phrase, that heading comes from the short story I mentioned by Raymond Carver, what we talk about when we talk about love. And if you read this short story, it's a painful short story about dysfunctional couples talking about love, which really isn't about love. It's about pretty much dysfunctional, abusive relationships. And for some reason, that story came to mind when I got to this section of the talk, because I think a lot of the ways we talk about learning in schools is also dysfunctional. But there are some glimmers of hope. One of them is in science and engineering education standards, or SEED standards in Utah. As Dr. Soul mentioned at the beginning, I got to help with some of the writing of these. Here's my own personal copy, one of the rare printed copies. Most of them are on the computer. And they emphasize some really, really innovative things, progressive things, like thinking about learning not just as the facts of the things, but the practices and the big ideas we call cross-cutting concepts. But there are a couple of other pieces that I think are incredibly important and maybe overlooked if you look at the introduction to this document. And in this front matter, we say that science learning is personal. We say that science learning is multi-purposed for people. And we say that all students are capable of such learning. I think this is the most important part of all of our standards. In addition to this idea that science itself as a discipline is valuable and relevant, that science is a shared way of knowing, that science has principles and some kind of longevity to it, that it's important. So there are these two other pillars, I think, that science has this personal connection and science has this big community that we should pay attention to. So I like to break this up into, like, we can know things and we can do things, but there's also these other bigger principles. And I think those other bigger principles might inform why the solar eclipse was so meaningful and why being taught by a robot is not so much fun. So I've been trying to sort out a way to put this into context. I suggest that a lot of what we do in school is centered around knowing stuff. And another, I'd say, half of what we do in school is about doing stuff. You know, your skills and your knowledge, maybe. But I think what we overlook, and I think what Tommy and Margie were thinking about is like, who am I? How is it that I figure out my own role? How do I understand my own self? We don't have learning objectives for this because it's your own self. And then in addition to that, I think there's becoming a part of a communing, that there's a bigger context, the scientific context, for example, or being part of a society or being a citizen. And these don't get mentioned even in our SEED standards and our science education standards, but they're inherent there. Whether you write them down or not, this becoming and communing have got to be already there. If you ignore them, then you just let them, you know, become whatever they might become without paying attention to them. Mrs. L was really wanting us to be safe, I guess, and wanting us to do our reading homework. She wasn't thinking about the becoming and the communing, the experience we could have had. So let me give you some examples of what I'm thinking about. The solar eclipse experience was important to me. I took this extra picture of the solar eclipse on a timed camera. Uncle Mark, who I mentioned before, he's this guy on the left. And then me and the rest of my family here on the far right. We're all looking at the, you know, before the full eclipse, we're looking at the partial eclipse through our eclipse glasses. So just take this in, we're all in eclipse glasses, and this idiot here is pointing, right? This guy is John Settlage. He's co-editor of one of the most important journals in all of science education in the world. And he's pointing with, it's hilarious. My family never gets tired of looking at this picture. But we were there together. That's the point, that it wasn't just my own personal experience, but the oohs and ahs and gasps and the actual being there with this group. I think we see a lot of other examples in our own physics department. The material science lab, you see people in harbor launching balloons. They have to know stuff. They have to be able to do stuff. They have to be able to work together, and they're changed as a person as a result of these kinds of experiences. Planetarium, another great example of, you got to be able to do the stuff. You got to be able to know the stuff, but there's also this other context that it's all sitting in, and that is working with others. Dance ensembles, which you may not be familiar with, I think they do an outstanding job of not just the knowing and practicing, but each person has to know their own space and their own identity as a dancer, and they work together in those spaces. And I suspect after watching many dance rehearsals, that's something that maybe our physics labs could learn quite a bit from. We don't know so much about working together and creating a shared product in our physics labs. And I'm not blaming anyone about this. This has just not been a part of our culture in our physics labs, but it's something we have examples for in other places. Another example that I have is, oh, look, it's my band again. What a great way to bring up the band. But working to play with one another in a band is a great example of not just the facts that you know about where the notes happen to be, or the skill of actually playing the scale or the progression, but also what is your role as the pianist, as the drummer? What is it that I'm supposed to be taking on? And how do you fit all these different ideas together at the same time? I've learned as much from playing in a band in the last 2 years than all of my music education before that point. And it's because of that shared collaboration and my sense of being within that spot. Bill Evans, who is also in a pretty good band with Miles Davis and John Coltrane and a few others, he's summed it up this way, that aside from the weighty technical problem of collective coherent thinking, like working together, there is this very human social need for sympathy for all members to bend to some common result. Like, it's not just like, hey, you play this part and I play this part. We've got to work together. We've got to figure out who we are individually and as ensembles. Again, something we could learn in our physics labs. And maybe for the rest of schools? Because schools may not be thinking about, or maybe we assume that we just become, or that we just learn to commune in schools, but we don't actually make it happen. We don't actually make that something that is one of our explicit goals. So I propose these ideas like, who does need school, or maybe reconsider what is school, and will that help us think about what we're doing in practice there, especially in a time of pandemic and remote learning. Can we be like solar eclipses in schools? Probably not, but maybe like dance rehearsals, maybe like band rehearsals. Can we make the becoming communing more of an explicit set of outcomes or goals or purposes for education? And in a pandemic moment in particular, we've got all these tools, the Zooms and the Canvases and the pads and the screens and all the things, but do they help? And I argue, no, not by themselves, not even in the least. They probably just hinder. We throw those things at our teachers, and they don't necessarily change our orientation towards education. And in the future, we might want to think about those particular things, especially when school is placed in some kind of societal context that is more than just the school itself. When we say, I want my kids to learn in school, we mean many, 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 many different things when we say that word learning. Sometimes we mean reading, sometimes we mean arithmetic, sometimes we mean being a citizen, sometimes we mean becoming a human being who's capable of working with others. But we're not always so clear about that. I'll also leave you with this quick epilogue. As you may know, this talk was supposed to have been given last week. And so the who needs school statement suddenly the answer became clear. I guess we don't need school. We took the couple of days off because we had to. And you know what? I don't think anyone was that much worse off for it. So that reminds me that the school itself is not the solution. It's what we do with the school, what we put in the school. We want school to be a place where we learn to work together and we learn to become, but school isn't inherently going to be that place unless we make it so. So I'll leave you with that. I know we've got a couple minutes for questions or things thrown through screens. But thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to listen to me figure out my own thinking.
Okay, so we can all do virtual applause here. You can even click on the applause button. I would like to open it up for questions now, and I would like to give first priority to our students in the physics seminars course. And you can ask your questions by either unmuting your microphone and jumping in, and then Dr. Johnson will answer the question. Or if you feel more comfortable at it, you can go ahead and type it into the chat. And so let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Dr. Johnston, I was curious, do you think there's anything that public schools do better than private schools or vice versa?
No.
Just in general?
I mean,
okay.
It depends on the school. Like, there are fantastic private schools, there's fantastic public schools, there are fantastic public charter schools, and I should say, schools of all sorts to me are very, very sacred places. The fact that we have a society that has decided we're going to invent schools, we're going to invent education, that's not something to be taken for granted. But then, to say that's a public priority, that's amazing that we thought of that. But it also means we're responsible for it. It means that it's not just there, we invented it. So we have to keep reinventing it as our needs change, or as as we realize the things that it might be missing. And that can happen in private and public schools both.
So I have a question. So there's like we're trying to progress towards a classroom that has a lot more like flex and a lot more like technological like introduction. And we're trying to allow kids to be able to set more of their own pace in a classroom, and then teachers kind of just facilitate that information when they get there. Do you think, since we're giving students more like a priority on setting their own pace, do you think that ruins some of the community in the classroom? Like there's going to be kids that are ahead and they're going to be able to set on projects that kids that are a little slower don't have the chance to. And so them being able to have those big moments at the same time is going to be significantly harder. Do you think that's a hurdle that we're going to have to figure out how to jump through? Or do you think we're already well on our way to figure that out?
I think you see there's one particular very large district in northern Utah that's working on more of the individualized learning model, and there's some real merit to that, right? Like let's address every student for who they are and how they're learning and what their needs are. But I think I agree with you. There's also some pitfalls that part of why I think we have schools and why we need schools and why I particularly value schools is like we need to learn to work together. We need to learn to collaborate. We've got some big problems that no individual learner working at their own pace is going to be able to figure out. So yes, let's find ways to help people learn in lots of different ways. But I think you're right. We can't then say, no, let's forget about learning together. And let's try to all learn and help each other at the same time.
So Jonathan Rizzo has a question that he typed in for everybody to hear it. My computer microphone broke yesterday, so I'll type this one. You mentioned sabbatical lets you take a step back and take a fresh look at things. How your viewpoint on science education and education in general changed during your sabbatical?
Yeah, so two things happened. One was sabbatical, and you got to take a step back. And I should say, you can't just invent ideas. Like I'm no genius, and anyone who says they're a genius and that all the ideas are going to come out of their own head because they thought about them, they're just full of it, and I don't trust them. Reading was really, 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 really important. And I read some stuff from Mark Enfield about schools or after school settings in urban neighborhoods. That was enlightening. Some from Doug Larkin about the nature of science education and how we use student thinking, and Brian Brown about linguistics in urban settings where people are coming from different languages. Anyway, read, yes, as Dr. Palin said, read all the things. Sabbatical gave me a chance to not just think about my own thoughts, but to stir them around with others. The other thing that this particular sabbatical kicked me in the gut was the pandemic and this new learning situation. And I thought I was going to be writing about all the different authentic experiences we could have working together in close quarters in revised classrooms, and then pandemic hit, and I all the stuff I was thinking about just doesn't feel relevant at all. And I just want to go cry in a corner, which I did for some amount of time, and then realized, no, this is a great pace to kind of think through what we want out of education. This is a great challenge to us, and we should face that.
All right. Any other student questions?
Yeah, I have a question. It seems to me that there's kind of a balance between like teaching everybody kind of the same thing, and then eventually people will realize kind of what their strengths are or what they're more interested in, and then at that point they will like split off and become more specialized. Or you could kind of figure out like what students are better at, like at a young age. Like you could say, oh, these students are really good at math or whatever, so we're going to teach them more of that. Like kind of before the student could even make that decision. So what do you think we're in a good place in terms of that spectrum, or do you think we could do better?
Well, we could always do better.
Right.
One thing I agree that, everyone needs to develop their own interests, and everyone should like get a rich set of experiences and then, start to dive into things they really, really love. I'll push back on anyone who says, and I know Thomas, you weren't saying this, but it's a good example when you said something like people might discover they're good at math at an early age, or they're good at science, or they're good at poetry at an early age. And I will push back on that severely and say, if you think you're good at math at an early age, you should take up some poetry. And if you think you're good at poetry at an early age, you should take up some math. because everyone is capable and good at doing math because you're human, and everyone is good at doing poetry because you're human. And we need all of those voices and all of those learners to be learning all of the things and recognizing their capability in all of those things in order to have, this is a rights issue. This is an equality issue. You only get choices if you have the ability to make those choices. You only get to choose to do math if you've learned the math or learned the poetry or learned the dance. So let's make sure we all learn things together.
So John, we have a question from the chat from Sarah.
So Adam's reading, I'll read
I can read it. So Sarah's saying, after seeing what people thought the future of education would look like with all of the tech advances and then the pandemic forcing us to lean into these, do you think education will continue to progress towards these predicted methods or pull away from that into a new direction? I don't know. I think we'll see, right? I think we're learning. I think we're learning to be dissatisfied with the tech. We're learning to see, and this has happened time and time again. We see that the tech itself, the innovation itself, whatever that might be, doesn't itself make education better, doesn't itself make learning better. It gives us some new tools, but we've got to make sure that those tools are matched up with some end goal in mind, that we use those tools appropriately. And I think we skipped to the tools before we thought about why we're using them. I should also say, and John maybe is about to say this, like it's well past the end of our official seminar, and usually of a room full of people, and we should say, yeah, you're free to go, good heavens. I will not take any offense if people just suddenly disappear, but I'll stick around for questions for as long as people have them, at least until my 4:30 class.
Okay, let's see.
I have a question.
Okay.
So it's sort of related to what Thomas was talking about, but so I think an issue that people have to deal with, and that I've struggled with, is valuing education or taking something away from it versus seeing education as something you have to endure and just go through and finish. So how, like, I know experiences like the Eclipse experience that you're talking about, something like that, you know, could help some people, but how can we help people take some value from education, and particularly with sustained online education, like what we're dealing with now? I feel like that can probably make it worse, make it feel like it's just really something you have to go through. So what can we kind of do to combat that?
I don't have all the answers, but I'll give you some example what occurs to me. So I mentioned earlier that when we saw the pandemic, I was trying to help find ways to help. I don't know how to help teachers. Like, good heavens, like K-12 teachers are under such awful duress right now. Let me know what I can do, but we haven't figured out what we can do to help each other yet. This is just a tough problem. But one thing I'd suggest is that we often say, oh, we've all gone online. How do I take my classroom science and bring it online? And I think that's the wrong way to approach things. Like, in a classroom, you're saying, how can my kids learn science? So instead of trying to recreate that and shove it into the at-home environment or the online environment, think, I want people to learn science. Now, what does that mean for an at-home experience? So, for example, now that you're at home, what a great opportunity you have to spill stuff in your kitchen or go outside and look at what happens to be growing there at that particular time, or how this water is draining, or when the sun is coming up, or when the sun is going down, or where the sun is going down, or where is Venus right now. Like, there's so much science going on at home that what a great opportunity. Like, now you're not labored, you're not having to shoulder the issue, the school tasks. Now you're free to do different kinds of science at home. And how can we take that on in a different way, or take that opportunity for what it is, rather than trying to squish what our school curriculum was and put it in an at-home environment. Like, that's not fair to the kids, the students, or their parents. And frankly, like, if we give teachers, I'm looking at Michelle Orman, the president-elect of Utah Science Teachers Association, teachers like Michelle, like, if we just said, hey, here's 3 months, you can plan it however you want to make learning happen. If we give teachers that kind of control over the thing that they're already expert at, they could make that happen. I think we've kind of taken that away from them a little bit. I mean, a lot.
Okay, well, let's thank Dr. Johnston again. He will be able to stay around, I hope. I'm going to end the meeting because I have a class that starts in 30 seconds. Hopefully I can just leave it and Dr. Johnston can remain. So thank you all for attending. We look forward to seeing most of you next week, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, John.
I think
Thank you, Adam.
I'm confident, John, you can leave, and I